Okay, good evening, everyone. There might be a few people still joining us, still battling with Teams to enter the meeting, but I thought I'd just get started with some housekeeping notes. First of all, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you all here tonight. This is one of a series of talks we've been organising for Extraction, our current exhibition at Jupiter Artland. I'm Eloise, I'm the curator at Jupiter, and tonight I am absolutely honoured to be in conversation with Andrew Mummery, the curator of the Carol Rhodes Estate. Just wanted to run over just a very few things quickly just before we begin. Andrew and I are going to just have a quite free-flowing chat. Andrew is coming to us from Carol's studio tonight, so at some point I might pause our slideshow of images just so we can see a few things in Carol's studio. But yeah, we will just chat together. There will be a chance for questions at the end in a little Q&A format. So please, if you have any questions throughout as they come to you, please feel free to type those in the chat. I hope it goes without saying, please be respectful in the chat. I'm sure that's not something I need to say, but I'll say it anyway. The other thing to note is that tonight is being recorded, the online talk, so everything you can see on your screen, and it will be archived on Jupiter's website. I think Teams should have sent you a notification about this as well, but just so everyone is aware. Only other thing to say is if you're having technical difficulties, you can message Janaki, who is named Exhibitions on this call, or Hamish, who should have Hamish Jupiter Artland after his name. So yeah, if you're struggling at all, or you lose the images or lose Andrew or I, they are your points of contact for tonight. They are our fantastic curatorial team here to support. So yeah, I think that's kind of everything I need to say from a housekeeping point of view. So yeah, I just wanted to take a moment to kind of briefly introduce the premise of Extraction, our current exhibition at Jupiter, and kind of why we're here tonight. Extraction is a show ultimately about energy and about energy eras, the production of energy and the extractive processes that certainly in the past that has involved. It came out of really thinking closely about the landscape around Jupiter Artland. So here in West Lothian, the land is very much marked by histories of extraction, particularly the shale oil industry, from which on our horizon line we have these huge red bings, these heaps of waste left over from extracting oil from shale rock. And we also have, right from the office window behind me, we have a view of where the Forties oil pipeline comes into land at Grangemouth. And so I was thinking a lot about these layered histories of land. This year marked the very first year that Jupiter as an organisation has been running on renewable energy. So there was also a kind of organisational impetus to be thinking about energy systems and, you know, what they entail, what they involve, who and what they might leave behind. And I suppose I started thinking about Carol Rhodes's work in relation to that, partially because I suppose as a starting point, because of Rhodes's motifs and subject matter felt very relevant to some of those things I was thinking about, and thinking through that landscape around Jupiter, thinking about scree, thinking about slag heaps, these kind of strange shaped hillocks that appear throughout her work, airports, car parks, motorways. It's kind of a depiction of the West Lothian and kind of Central Belt landscape in her work that felt really relevant to the questions that I wanted Extraction to ask. You know, thinking through these, the strange edges of places that feel very particular to this part of Scotland, and that feel at once kind of familiar as someone who takes the train a lot between Glasgow and Edinburgh, but also extremely strange. So that was kind of the point at which we contacted Andrew, who very kindly agreed to loan and arrange a loan of two of Carol's works for in the show. And in the slideshow that's currently rotating on the screen, you'll see those two works. One is Deposits, which is a painting, and the other is an untitled drawing. And I'm sure Andrew and I will come onto those. I just wanted to share, kind of almost as a starting point, a lovely, lovely Carol Rhodes quote that Andrew shared with me during the kind of development of the show. That I think really kind of speaks more eloquently than I ever could about her inclusion in this particular exhibition. So the quote reads, "Just passing those red bings, apparently you can go up them. There are little paths and scrubby growth. I imagine it's a sci-fi type landscape, right up my street. The whole journey in the train between Glasgow and Edinburgh has become a huge delight over the years here. The whole vista is actually quite minor, and not even as in a minor key. It's made up of a lot of small, interesting things. It's like the back of something." So yeah, I suppose without further excessive talking from me, I would love to introduce Andrew Mummery, curator of the Carol Rhodes Estate. And I think it's worth saying that prior to this role, Andrew ran two contemporary art galleries, Andrew Mummery Gallery and Mummery and Schnell, before his relocation to Scotland. And I think, at least from an external view, that work is driven by a really strong dedication to supporting artists in the production of work and in the exhibition of work and in work kind of finding audiences. Andrew worked closely with Carol Rhodes during her lifetime and has curated multiple exhibitions of her work alongside editing, contributing to shaping publications on her practice, which is actually how I initially got to know Carol's work, is through those publications and through that work to, yeah, really promote and spread her work. So yeah, Andrew, I thought Deposits, the painting, which conveniently sections of are on screen right now, might be a lovely place to start thinking about, maybe about some of Rhodes's methods, actually. Because I think when you stand in front of a painting like Deposits, at least I was certainly very, very struck by the way in which Rhodes achieves this sense of flatness. And yet there's so much going on in terms of texture with brush strokes. You've got this opacity and depth combined with a kind of transparency or lightness. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about her process, maybe, and we can start there.
Yes, thank you, Eloise. Yes, it's I think one of the things that is most striking about Carol's paintings when you first see them is they're really quite small. They're all quite small. She never made a paint. The largest painting she ever made was approximately 70 by 80 centimeters. And I think that sort of almost handheld scale is something that was very, very important to her, because everything she did, the drawings, the paintings, the technique she used, was to do with a direct personal, almost, bodily contact with the painting that she was making. And that was something that was very important to her. And the surfaces, before she even started painting, the works are all on panel. She never worked on canvas. She didn't like the softness of canvas. She couldn't use that. So she would start with a hard board. It was original. She moved from doing on MDF to later to plywood, but the surface would be created using a flexotropic primer, which she would layer on and then sand down so that the surface was like smooth, almost like an ice rink. And she loved the fact that it was very smooth. And when you started applying the paint with a brush, it would go on very, very smoothly. And if it's not very apparent actually on necessarily in reproductions, but they're usually only a single layer of paint, although sometimes can be quite a thick layer or smoothed out, but usually a single layer, worked wet into wet. But she was very, very specific about the weight of the mark, and she would change things quite often. She would wipe things back if something wasn't quite right. She would wipe it back and start again. So although they look as though they have in fact made almost quite quickly, they could take a long, long time to finish, because she would make these small changes. But that surface quality was very, very important to her, even to the it's the importance of imposing a tensional function onto the surface of the paint. Was the grass long, she would ask herself? Was it short, wet, or dry? Was the soil sandy or chalky? And these things were something that were quite significant within that work. So when you see a painting of Carol's, it's worth looking at it closely. Often the paint actually I'm not a painter, so I don't know technically exactly how this is done, but using more than one color in one brush stroke. So you're brushing through perhaps 2 or 3 colors, and that can be seen. I don't know if when the details come back of deposits, you can see a little bit of that, I think, in that painting.
Absolutely. I think there's certainly something that this kind of intimacy and this that kind of direct personal contact that you speak so eloquently about, is you really feel it standing with the works, I think. And I think in terms of that time and that kind of that process of wiping back and repainting, that almost what feels like an almost slightly perfectionist tendency. I think you kind of feel that almost in, these works feel very attentive. I think although, yes, a single layer of paint can often look like it's effortless, I think there is something in the work that feels very studied and very like close listening to the landscape is what I often feel. Like it's almost like something that feels very intentional. And I think some of that energy comes through. We have some lovely brush strokes that have returned now. Some of these
yes, exactly. Those exactly. You can see a little bit of that. But it was tiny marks. I mean, that one the shot that's just gone, very, very small, tiny brush marks on a bigger, broader expanse of brush. I mean, they were kind of, actually, I can possibly show you just a range, because I'm in Carol's studio. We're still sort of packing a few things away, including some of her brushes. So I can show the range. A quick look at this. I'll just pick up it.
That would be lovely. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment.
I don't know whether you can see, anybody can see this properly, but there we are. That's a little selection of a glass jar containing some of Carol's brushes. So you can see very, very thin, very fine brush there, and a broader one there. And that gives you a range of the size, but these would be very carefully used at particular parts of the support that she's painting on. And she would be very intensely. She would, intense periods of concentration on the paintings when she was making them.
Yeah, so gorgeous to see her tools, actually, Andrew. Feels very live. And I think there's something really magic that's happening between that pot of brushes and then the surface of these works. And it's really interesting what you say about canvas, because I think did you say almost she didn't like the softness of canvas?
Yeah, she wouldn't know.
There
are all the paintings she made. Well, at least she made things painted on canvas at art school, but all the mature paintings that she started in the early 90s were on board, hardboard to begin with, then as MDF, and then plywood. But that very hard, smooth surface was. She said she needed that in a way. So it sort of. That was important. And actually, the surfaces of the paper as well. I mean, she worked the whole. Even the papers that she worked on when she did the drawings were again something that would be had a particular feel to them. That was important to her, tactility, and that sort of that very handmade haptic feel to the applying the pencil and all the paint.
Yes, haptic and kind of tactile were two words that I'd written down on my little notes about thinking through that surface, and as well I think in a way it's kind of about feeling through that surface. That's kind of what those haptic and kind of tactile registers bring from the work for me. And I love this. Was it a quote that you just read to us about almost the wetness of the grass? I think one thing that I've been really drawn to in her work is the ways in which I almost feel like different soils or different kind of gravels or rocks or
Yeah.
earth are kind of
Oh,
quite differentiated from one another, you know, and again that comes back to that attentiveness and sort of that things aren't incidental.
no, no,
Um,
not at all. No, she very specifically. I mean, that's a quote from her. Whether the soil was sandy or chalky was something she
yeah,
was very much thinking about. So it's almost as she's inhabiting those landscapes in some way, or at least the material surfaces of them.
yes,
Um, Certainly, I mean, she was, she had a sort of connection to that. She would go, you know, walking in the landscape. There's a whole feel, a sort of certain sort of, physical, connection with being in a particular place at a particular time. I mean, that whole idea of the journey she talks about a lot. This journey between Edinburgh and Glasgow, whether it's
mm,
on a bus or a train, and she would cycle a lot as well. So there's that
yes,
connection between different ways of space, different ways space appears as you're moving through it, through a
mm,
moving train window. I mean, a lot of it's fairly the more aerial views, the connection looking out of a plane window. Certainly, that's
mm,
something that um, is evident, but actually closer to the ground. In fact, some of the way that the landscape in that Midlothian landscape undulates as you travel through it on a train, with quite
yes,
unexpected sort of dips and hollows and areas of sort of water, surface water and scrubby bushes and things like that. That's the sort of thing Carol really like. A minor key. She wasn't interested. She about minor key. She wasn't interested in big grand gestures. It talked about the backs of buildings, places that
mm,
are overlooked. She felt, people either would dismiss as being ugly. She always thought that she found all the places she depicted interesting. I mean, they may be slightly unsettling in some ways as well, but they were there. It's this semi-connection to the landscape, and she was, as a child, she had a quite peripatetic existence because she was, although born in Edinburgh, brought up for the first 14 years of her life in India, and would travel
yes,
around to school in India in the Himalayas, from where her father and mother were teaching in near Calcutta. So that sort of transition through landscape and feeling sort of distanced from something, not quite belonging where either in one place or another. When she moved to Scotland, it took as a child, well, to England, then to Scotland as a child, there was this always a sort of not being fixed. So there's a lot about these paintings which are to do with almost fixing something that you to try and find a connection.
yes, yeah. I think it's so interesting to hear you talk about almost those journeys that she undertook. I think um, there's kind of for me at least, I feel like I'd maybe read or thought about her work having, you know, playing a lot with distance, and playing a lot with the kind of aerial viewpoint. But I do think that the counterpoint to that, and almost like one of the key tensions that I feel in front of her work is that you have got that sense of a body moving through something, and that the body is absolutely there. You know, they are bodily as paintings.
Mm.
They feel like they have this kind of urgent intimacy. You're pressed right up against them, and I think you know, it might be easy to overlook that in thinking that they are these compositions at a distance. I think that proximity is absolutely there as well, that intimacy. Um, Speaking about her variety of distances, Andrew,
Mm.
um, I mean, in terms of thinking as well, in terms of her composition, um, I wrote down a word which I think is a word she used, which is teetering, thinking about the ways in which things are held in balance
Mm.
in composition, how there are counterpoints, how actually I think in lots of her works that we're seeing on our screen, there's almost imbalance. There are kind of no horizons, no vanishing points, and things are off center or you know, there are voids as well as these areas of beautifully kind of worked up detail. Um, yeah, and I wondered
Yes,
if you
she
wanted to say
what?
anything more about her, the way she
Yeah.
composes, the way she pulls together these kind of forms and
Well,
shapes.
composition was extremely important to the composition of the painting, which was all that the drawings that you're seeing now were basically the cut. She would use them as cartoons. She'd work out every detail of the composition in a drawing before she started work on a painting. And each of the drawings is exactly the same size as the paintings. The drawing will be transferred, traced onto the support, so that she had an immediate composition to start with. So they weren't worked out in that sense in the painting. What changed in the painting was obviously adding the color and the paint, but the compositions were very, very carefully worked out. And she was talking the composition. She wanted a feeling of them somehow being of equality. So equality. Everything's equal. There's not equal emphasis on things. It wasn't just about a top, bottom, middle. She preferred to see them as being almost as as I said, sort of an egalitarian thing. I mean, she was involved quite a lot in the 1980s in the women's movement, the peace movement, Free University in Glasgow, and Free University in Glasgow, and that sort of commitment to a sense of belonging and the as is said, as a non sort of hierarchical system. The landscapes were partly about ideas of access, or what you can and can't see or have access to. And the other thing is that I think it's quite important with this idea of the distance, the aerial view. I'm going to read out a short quotation, which is it's this what you feel, the feelings you get when you look down on something. And she says, it seems as if what you see when you look down from the air is something that is already over, nostalgic. Everything is beautiful, like a memory or dream, and with order and purpose. Distance takes place of time. Large vistas. If you can see everything, you feel more secure, in control, as when the light is on. But there is a line that, when crossed, turns the omni-view into an agoraphobic panic. Nothing to hold on to. And are my pictures on the line? And that tension between being in control and losing control is very important, I think. She was striving to get that sort of balance when, she didn't, nothing but be too high, you can't see anything, too close, the distances would vary throughout, different periods of the works, but this idea of being on a line somewhere was quite important to her, and I think that's sort of worth bearing in mind when you look at the work in general. Is that it's this idea of distancing, but also wanting to maintain some sort of connection, and hence back to the sort of the handmadeness of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that line, or kind of being exactly on that line, is something that I think you can almost feel sometimes, whether it be in a sense of the unnerving, a sense of the dreamlike, this kind of interplay. And I think it's funny because I'd also written down that I sometimes, maybe this is a personal thing, but I almost have this sense of the works as they hold something quite secretive, quite mysterious, despite the fact that almost in form, they're drawing a bit on diagrams, on mapping. And yeah, it struck me there in that quote you were reading, almost the aerial view should be this feeling of knowing everything, of feeling safe almost, of kind of having the details of everything laid out in a particular way before you. But into that, I think she's introducing this kind of very mysterious tension and kind of almost unreality that is just so compelling in combination. At least that's certainly how I feel looking at these.
Well, there's certainly things, but hidden places. She took that things that it's, as I said, she sees them as often as the backs of things rather than sort of the obvious views. It's so there is something that's slightly kind of. She was a big reader, big fan of sci-fi, science fiction. Ursula Le Guin, J.G. Ballard, this kind, and James Tiptree Jr., who's somebody I didn't know, who was actually a woman writer who used a male pseudonym. I've forgotten the woman's name, I'm afraid. Somebody will know, I'm sure. But these, strange, uncanny kind of, The other thing actually connected to that is humor. She did actually see a lot of these odd disjunctions of scale in her paintings as funny. I think that sort of the quote I read out earlier sounds obviously quite serious. This idea of this sort of being in control or not being on that edge, that anxiousness of being on edge. There's the other side of that is a sort of humor when something like, I mean, she talks about the disjunction between the land and the sea, or a building, but that small building against a big building, an addition of a strange bit of color, an orange or something like that. She said there's certainly a humor to them, so they're not at the same. It's not this serious sort of psychological reading that has been attempted on some of the works, but you shouldn't lose touch with the fact that there is this humor and this joy in the making of them as well, I think. So there's two sides to it. Although the subject can be like with this mineral extraction and the way that man has disrupted the landscape and more than this, she did feel that very acutely, but at the same time there is this sort of the strangeness of what's going on, and the sort of what this odd juxtaposition of things.
I think that really comes across in certain moments, almost where, I don't know, certain works where it feels like the human infrastructure almost might be totally useless, or sort of has this absurdity about it, this sort of comic absurdity about it, in certain details, or a certain sort of curve of color or a certain shape, almost like just these very sort of very characterful details in so many of the compositions. I think you started to touch, Andrew, on in talking about Carol's process, about the ways in which she moved from drawing through to painting. And I wondered if you wanted to dwell a little bit longer on either on some of those annotated cartoons, or kind of maybe also what comes with and before the drawing, which I know how important photography was to her practice, both found photographs and her own. So maybe we could talk briefly about some of those images and some of that process.
Well, I'm just going to read something again from an interview that she did back in 1998, because when I can, I've got the relevant bit here. I'll read something in Carol's own words, which I think is quite nice. But she says, "I get an idea or notion or a feeling that on the one hand is extraordinarily vague, but has got a very strong core. Then I look through a lot of different photographs in the books I've got in the studio and flesh that out, little bits from different things. It can be tiny portions from a huge array of different photographs. Then I pin down the thing that was in my mind and spend a lot of time drawing it out." So this is, she said that all the drawings are all lines. She said, "I work out the lines exactly where I want them. I must admit that I'm pretty obsessive about that. And I go through minute changes. So I've got the skeleton that gives me a freedom to use paint." So these are photographs that she would initially sometimes take herself in the places that near where she lived or where she was traveling through. And otherwise, as she said, there was a huge library of books. I mean, there's you get some indicator that one of the few of the shots, there was a whole shelves of books at the back, and shelves of books and parts laid out on the parallel tables that she used in the studio to work from. So there is this idea, but she had ability to keep in mind certain details that she would then use. So these drawings are like, almost like collage together from different sort of elements. Sometimes she would use there are a few examples where there's a single photograph was used as the source material, but that's more unusual than the ones which were sort of an amalgamation of different views. But
So sorry, it's me interrupting, but do you think where she used almost one image, it was because that particular landscape or moment was almost already Carol Rhodes, almost already collaged?
I think it must have been, oh yes, I can use the whole of that. I mean, it would be quite instinctive, I think. I mean, this is the point. The composition were they were basically, as she said, it was threat. She had a vague notion, I think she put it in that quote like this, and then it has to be fleshed out somehow. And I think, that photograph, I can use all of that. And but sometimes the detail is absolutely tiny. I mean, there are lots of some of them have, well, some of the big drawing that you have at Jupiter actually is an exceptional example. Is that there's quite a lot of notes on that, which were references to page numbers from different books. She had a sort of annotated system, so we can trace the book that she's referring to. But even if the page number is found, and it's very difficult to see. Well, except for because they often do with color notes actually as well. She's in the color on a page. It's not just a detail of an image of a fence or something, or a doorway, or a bit of bush. It could also be a particular color, but it's often quite frustrating to actually, which one is she referring to on that page? And she would also that what you're seeing now, she would make very precise notes of which colors she was using to mix the paints that she was going to use. Partly because that would have been remind her when she scraped back which colours she wanted to reuse again. But they're also like a diary of the making of the paintings. And these are things that we only just recently came across when the Carol with the studios being cleared out. There's almost all the paintings, or well, I would say the majority of the paintings we have colour notes for. But more work needs to be done on those, because they are quite specific, as you can see there. There's lots of they refer to colours and what they're being used for, and where on the painting they're being used. But which stage of the painting, and if you don't have the finished painting with you, and it may be a painting she never finished, she would if she wasn't satisfied with the painting, she'd abandon it.
So these are truly sort of archival spirals.
Oh yes,
in terms of following up some of these.
Yeah,
some of these thoughts, colors, ideas, references even. So lovely to read some of these.
Yeah, there's another. I mean, this is just in terms of the terms of drawing. I mean, there's another quote that she gave a bit later on from the first one I read just out, was from 1998. There's another one in an interview that I did with her, which was published in a large monograph on her work. As she says, when I first went to art school, I just caught the end of that teaching of how to make a painting from sketches and studies and color notes, etc. But that was mostly, she says, already an affectation. So all that fetishization of the artist's process makes me queasy. But yes, the drawings are cartoons of paintings, entirely functional. I work out through them how to put together things from different photographic sources. Sometimes I've been able to use just one image of an existing place, though some elements may have to change as I work. The lines of the finished drawings are then traced onto primed board for painting. The painting sometimes can diverge from the drawing, and I might go back to the drawing to work out the changes. That's why I have different color lines to let me know which ones to retrace. You can see some of that on the drawing that's in Jupiter. Maybe when the details come up, you can see a bit of that. But she didn't see them as the one thing. She says they were functional. She kept them in a drawer. She never showed them for years. She didn't actually consider them to be anything other than works in progress. It's not works in progress, as functional. It's only when people started asking to see the drawings, and then sort of, they're actually, they're interesting. Oh, okay, I'll look at them again. So she did come around to seeing them as things to be exhibited. But it was only towards the second half of, the time I knew her, really. She would, we can do a show with some drawings in it. But I think their importance is actually is crucial to what she was doing, and actually it's more of an elaborate process than certainly later on. There are all sorts of scraps and things which we haven't quite worked out how she was using them in relation to the finished paintings, but it was in a very elaborate process. She was quite secretive about her working processes. In fact, I would never see anything when I went to the zoo that was in progress. It was only when works that were finished. And I didn't see a single drawing for years. And she once said, "Well, they look like that," and then closed the drawer again. So I didn't get. It was that they're not interesting.
So these were almost in a plan chest as
they were. They were process. Yes, they were in a plan chest. They still are the unframed ones. Yes, I mean that's kind of they were very important, but they were something that she considered to be, the painting was the thing really. But now I think, and she did come to see this, that they actually are very aesthetically very interesting in their own right. They have their own kind of drawing vocabulary in the way that her mark making vocabulary on the painting. And if you go up close, there's a lot of erased lines are erased and then reworked. You can see a bit in that one we're looking at now. But there are, different kinds of ways of making, usually with a pencil, but different kinds of ways of making a mark. But she was also, you would choose the paper she worked on quite carefully too.
Yeah, I've stopped us on these images just so we can have a little closer look. Yeah, I love the kind of overlaying of the lines, however functional, this almost sort of reddish shade that sits alongside the grey. And then I think possibly here the annotation of Brit air, Andrew, I think is that possibly
that Britain from the air? I think that's probably Britain from the air. There were a number of Britain from the air books. But yes, 28 would be the page number. But if we could find, you've got to try and identify on a photograph because she changed the scale of these buildings from the photograph. I mean, these could be quite big in the photograph and tiny in the painting. Yeah. But that continual play with scale, again, that's the sort of humor of them, making something that's actually in reality very big, very, very small.
Yeah.
Again, this sort of the overlook,
that playfulness.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Or diminishing diminishing the importance of something and raising the importance of something else to create a more egalitarian sort of egalitarian is not quite sort of an equal emphasis on different elements.
Diminishing some and then almost enlarging or sort of focusing in on others that might be by some people sort of dismissed as not worthy of artistic attention. I think that interplay in her work is so.
She was definitely interested in landscapes that that she felt had been overlooked, that people would not normally, painters certainly would not normally choose to depict.
Which I think is why the landscapes of extraction almost feature so again and again in her work. And in terms of her own photographs, Andrew, did she kind of keep a little archive of her own photographs to work from as well as kind of from?
Well, they were part of this. She would go, I think when she would start a new painting, she'd arrange on the tables her own photograph, piles of photographs, photocopies, but later printouts from Google Earth. You can see some of the tables. You can see this. These two sets of tables. The easel where she painted was stood in the middle. But all these tables were covered with, as you can see, those are her own photographs there. The previous photograph, that pile there is basically her photographs. So she would pre-select and then she'd then have them in piles, which she then goes through to refer as she was making the drawing and then the painting, or back to the painting and then up from the drawing. So yes, I think there was a certain amount of pre-selection for each painting. So if you can, there's some other shots there of some art history books as well she would use, usually for color. I mean, those are the geographical books. So they're these sort of, a lot of them were geology books as well as being the sort of, West Country from there and then castles from there. But some of those, you see their printouts there at the top. And cutouts from different magazines could be, those are going back. Yes, there. Well, that's more materials. But you can see more piles of her own photographs there.
Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of this, so this juxtaposition on the tables of the working materials, the photographs, the different sort of photographic sources, little geology, a bit of there's semi-precious stones, little geology books, and then and the Hamburg. This is these sort of aerial views of Hamburg and that all the business, all sorts of just. She didn't like the big sort of glossy picture books of sort of that she found those too aestheticized. She often preferred the more practical geographical books rather than the sort of she did have a lot of the sort of castles from the air and stately homes of Britain and all things like that, but she would take tiny details from something rather than it's as much the fact that they were aerial views and a particular subject matter.
While we're looking at this image together, Andrew, do you want to tell us a little bit about the clay the two clay objects that we can see here.
I don't
It's
really know them
fascinating.
because I mean, these were just they were on the table. She made these. Now, quite why, what their function might have been, I don't know. She never mentioned them to me at all. I mean, clearly she was, there was something again about making, possibly they had, they were, she would thinking about how to depict using those as a three-dimensional thing, because usually she's working from obviously printed surfaces, but from photographs. So they may be having something in 3 dimensions, even if they're quite flat. But it's also something, I think it's just that making what it feels like to make something like that. I think it's often, what it feels like to make that, and how does that connect to what it feels like to make the brush mark when you're painting it.
Yeah.
So I think there's that handmade thing about them, and I think they're sort of, I'm quite sure they're plasticine, quite what they are. So yes, there are 2 or 3 of them. Well, those are 2 there, and there's another one which has got slightly broken, but they seem to be. I don't know there's anything else. There's no evidence she made it. Anything else like that. But it's interesting. There's being like mounds. I mean, that's kind of, that fact I think is interesting. But it goes back to that haptic, tactile thing. I mean, what does it feel like what we feel like to make something like that?
Absolutely. I think when we looked at them in the studio with you, they struck me almost like little maquettes or little, and I think there's something also in so many of these kind of diminished buildings in Carol's work that does evoke almost like model making or miniatures sometimes. But yeah, just
there's no model buildings or anything like that. She didn't make anything like that. Well, as far as certainly nothing seems to have. I don't think she did. I think it's because they're sort of or plastic or something that you can mold.
Yes,
I think that's
important.
and I think, but if you look at the sort of mound on the right hand side of the deposits painting, it's very close to that, to the sort of the central, the larger of those 2 sort of models in the middle of that photograph. And I think again, I mean, you can see that actually takes up more room when I remember it now. That sort of very large, most of the central right hand side of that painting is very close to one of those models.
Yes,
you see the flat top
with its kind of slanted sides and flat top. Yeah, exactly.
So they may date from the same time as that painting, because there's no way of knowing when she made those, but they could well have been made in around that time. I think it comes back to this haptic idea of what does it feel like to make something.
Absolutely. Yeah, it comes back for me as well to that wet grass or that clay soil.
But
and I think just fascinating objects, especially for a little bit of insight into a practice that I feel like so often almost a practice is spoken about in terms of flatness, to then see, rendered these kind of very 3-dimensional and almost little mounds and heaps as kind of miniature Bing sculptures. It's just a very gorgeous insight into a studio. I'll set our images off rotating again, and if we need to come to certain ones, I can flip back and forth. I think, coming to this idea of extraction, I think, it's so, thinking through Carol's practice in these works, it makes me think a lot about how landscape is created and this kind of artificiality of it, and the sort of terrain and strata, seeing those books that she was working from as well. Oh yeah, I just wanted to say, I think the view into her studio there with the two tables, it's just an incredible way to be synthesizing reference material, I think. That you're almost surrounded by these kind of layers and layers of image and of things that you want to be at play in the painting.
It's interesting how that sort of, they're almost like the palimpsest. It's things layered one on top of another. I mean, the drawings have something of that in them. It's harder to see with the paintings because although the paintings would have had, because she scrapes white back to the hard ground again, they're actually very thin. They tend to be very thin layers of paint. They're not built up or encrusted in any way at all.
Mm.
But I think there is this feeling that there is a layering, and I think she was very conscious about wanting to try and get that across, even in very thin layers of paint. That you're not just looking at one kind of surface. It's a depiction of a landscape surface, but it's also kind of, there's lots of sort of bodily references there to sort of, whether it's to organs or veins, or also, it's all sorts of kind of, there's that other side of things that was, again, this connection between, your physical, the physicality of the making of the painting, the physicality when you're looking at a painting, when you're also the same thing, that connection with moving through a landscape or looking
Yes.
down onto a landscape.
Yeah.
And this idea of underground strata, surfaces that have been built up over years, that man-made, surfaces that were from a car park built over something. This miniature landscape that she was looking down on when in Glasgow, which she made a group of paintings related to, which had a car park, a subway station, a river, trees, little pathways, and that she would look down on that from her kitchen window. And when her son was born, she would take walk through his pram through this little landscape. And that, I think, was very important, the question of something you're grounded on but also looked down upon at a time when she's coming to starting painting again, finding a language that a painting language that she can use. So that's all connected, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think definitely, I feel it's really worth noting that, yeah, I totally agree with you. I see almost like arteries, muscle, kind of flesh in so many of her works, actually. And in so many ways, that's, that kind of another way that the body is present there. There's kind of this, I don't know, there's almost like a desire or a pleasure there as well, I think. Reminds me of some surrealism, almost like some Eiffel Colquhoun, some kind of, I don't know, that kind of rawness, evisceration, whether it's kind of in legs or that sort of fleshy, the flesh evoked in some sense or other, which I think is really, worth noting in her work. And really is just, very compelling, very powerful. I think I realized when we just spoke about her kind of reference material in the studio as well, Andrew, we didn't really talk about in terms of layering, in terms of her art historical references, of which there are so many. And I think when we stood in the studio together, I said, I think it's quite special, actually, that these works, they carry many references to the history of art, the history of painting, and they carry them quite lightly. I think for me, they're not sort of heavy and weighed down by them. But did you want to share with us any kind of insight on that?
One very important aspect for her when she was beginning about starting painting again was a visit she made with her then painter partner Richard Walker to the National Gallery, in the Sainsbury wing at the National Gallery in London, just after it had opened in around 1992, and seeing these small-scale Italian and Northern Renaissance paintings, which were for her, a very important thing. She, having been at art school when there was a sort of phase, was a lot of sort of macho figurative painting going on. To see something that actually which she called a sort of peculiar freedom with reality. It was smaller scale. It was, the sort of strange sort of distortions and of forms, and the playful composition. The fact they were, that she could think, there's something I can use here, something I can associate with, and that would be. So she had a particular fondness for 13th, 14th century Sienese painting, artists like Duccio, Sassetta, the Master of Osservanza. They were, and also the sort of landscape, Northern European landscape painting, again, a bit later periods. But she also, I mean, she had a very wide, very eclectic range of interests. I mean, also George Stubbs would be a later example. I mean, she's lots and lots of art history books, as well as the books that we said, which she would use, and it would be, but that it was that sort of a landscape that could be had a sort of other reality to an unreality about it, or that could be sort of energized in a sort of strange sort of psychological way. Some of these sort of saints in landscapes with sort of without strange animals and sort of, or this isn't actually Bosch necessarily, but with sort of these sort of strange contorted, disconnected figures. But that's sort of another kind of world which had a she had a could feel that I can make connections to that somehow. I don't have to make these big grand gestures. I can find small details and make something quite charged out of that. And they in the colors as well. This is something else that she was, that was a lot of what she borrows from art painting is the colors. But Indian miniature, because of her being brought up in India, the Indian landscape, the different colors of an Indian landscape, sort of Indian court miniatures from a certain period, which had another strange sort of way that space is depicted. She wouldn't use a sort of standard sort of perspectival single point perspective. It's all distorted, well, just mixed up, changed. So that was another thing about those paintings of that sort that she liked. But also landscape painters in the 19th century, Corot, the people, outdoor painters like that, Dutch 17th century Dutch painting. I don't think we have there's a we didn't because they I don't think the art history books were in separate shelves from the geography books in the studio, and they're not in these photographs. But you could one or two might come up in, but she would she'd have those around as well. But yes, there was. But she was fascinated. She would look at art a lot. I mean, and make notes from. There's a tiny little notebook made in the art gallery in the Gemälde gallery in Berlin. But noticing small differences, small bits of, a composition that we wouldn't necessarily or immediately see.
Yeah, being attentive to those elements in other practices throughout history, I think makes total sense. And almost as soon as in the studio we looked at just little bits and pieces of Carol's reference materials, and it just
and she in the lectures she gave, and we there are notes from the lectures that she would give at art school. She didn't.
Yeah, we've not even talked about her teaching.
No, well, she. I mean, yes, she was very influential teacher, and very fondly remembered by a lot of painters who, and not just painters actually. But she would use images of other artistry, along as sometimes contemporary art as well, alongside her paintings to give an idea what she'd been looking at. But often she'd be talking about things like composition, and it wasn't so much the subject matter really. It was things like the composition and the colour. But yes, she taught for a number of years in Glasgow and has been a very influential figure on a younger generation of as I say, not just who weren't just making paintings.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's something that when I was reflecting on Carol's legacy, I think as an artist to have the generosity to teach and to have that as part of your practice, and artists who I've met who've spoken about her influence and kind of how important that's been. And I think it's worth saying in Extraction we have works by Glasgow-based artist Siobhan McLaughlin, and Carol Rhodes' work has been such a kind of important reference point and touchstone for Siobhan. So to bring, I felt like by curating them together, bringing a little bit of that thinking about legacy almost into the gallery in hopefully quite an alive way. I think it's not only through the body of paintings and drawings that we have that legacy kind of continues on. Which is a lovely thing.
Yes.
I'm conscious that we have about 5 minutes left, unbelievably, because I feel like I could talk all evening about Carol's work. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing these lovely images. We can come back to these if we want them for any questions, but I'm just going to stop sharing this, and I'm going to see if any of our lovely attendees have any questions. And there are, oh my gosh, there's lots to read in the chat. Wonderful. Okay, I'll start at the top. Okay, Diane, thank you so much everyone for listening and for writing, and yeah, this is simply lovely. So Diane writes, is anyone here a friend of Carol's? I was at ECA when she was at GSA. We met through student activism, feminism, Greenham, and anti-nuclear activism, as well as artists. She was a phenomenal woman. She was my neighbour with her son in Four Walls Women's Housing Cooperative in the 90s. Diane, that's
Wow.
such a gorgeous message. Ah, and gives us a real, I feel like Andrew's touched on these elements of Carol's life, but that's just, yeah, such a wonderful thing to read. I'm sorry, I started reading that and didn't know it wasn't a question, but I do feel like that's worth reading out to everyone. Um, okay, and then Siobhan writes, thank you both. You've spoken about the haptic and the bodily in Carol's painting technique, and I'm wondering, since she was a women's rights activist, did she ever speak about landscape in relation to the female body?
I haven't come across any of the publicly kind of when the notes that we've got that she used for her lectures specifically relating to that.
Mm.
And there's nothing in the sort of the smaller notes that were dealing with that specifically. I don't think she was ever. I don't know if she was asked about it. The response hasn't been recorded, so I don't know that. I think we would be making. It's clearly there. I mean, there is an element of these being, as she said at one point, they're sort of like self-portraits in some sense, these landscapes. But I don't. Again, I think yeah, as I said, I think the specific answer is I don't know, and I haven't seen anything that she has specifically said anything in particular relation. But there's definitely something there. There is something there. I think within there is this idea of the body, and also what sort of painting can I make? As I said, when she was at art school, it was this sort of Glasgow School of Art in the beginning of the 80s was this sort of it was still this sort of big macho painting, and that wasn't what she wanted to make. And I suppose but again, I think she wanted something that remained at the end of the day enigmatic. We can be quite specific about some of the source material, but actually I think there is what's important about them is they remain enigmas in lots of ways.
Yeah, I think I would contribute to that although it's obviously not Carol's voice writing it, I loved reading. Andrew recently lent me a book with an essay by Naomi Pierce.
Oh yes, that's right. Yes,
And
that's
it's,
the yeah. Because
I
she was
think,
actually Naomi did ask friends of Carol's a
yeah,
bit about I should have remembered that. Yeah,
no,
there
and it's sort of
that's
and it
something. Yeah.
actually, yeah, it sort of almost takes up this problem of and I think Naomi writes even I want to write about Carol's work in relation to sex, and then it
Mm,
sort of laughs about this and it's sort of like, oh, I kind of can't quite, but it's very much there. And that yeah, so to one, if you haven't read that, I would absolutely recommend. I loved reading it, and it was actually a very different perspective on Carol's work,
mm.
and yeah, quite a personal essay, and very, very readable.
Yeah,
um
and
so yeah.
Naomi spoke to people who knew Carol very well as well. So that's kind of and when most of the time when I was when I worked with her as a gallerist, I was talking about this is sort of a lot of these things didn't come up in conversation because Carol didn't talk about that very much. You talk about the technique, the technique of the work and then what's the work depicting and so on. But so I've learned a lot about Carol as a person since doing the research in the archive. So and what Naomi did was for that essay was go directly back to talk to people who knew Carol. And so yes, I mean that's yes, that's good to raise that point. That
Yeah,
essay. Yeah.
lovely. I'm conscious that we are at 7:31, although we didn't get to everyone's questions. Diane, I can see that you've messaged to say that you have some photos of Carol at Greenham Common. If you are able to email those to the email address that Hamish has popped in the chat, that would
That
be
would be
wonderful.
great.
Would
There we do
love to
have
see
some. We do have some great photographs of Carol at Greenham Common. But any more for the archive would be great,
that.
Lisa.
More
Because
the
this is
merrier.
this there's quite one of the things we are trying to do with the archive now. Merlin James and myself is get together material of this period I said we've got some of it, but anything anybody's got from that period will be great to receive, because it is something that needs a lot more. I think it deserves a lot more of attention, actually, and at some point we hope to get some sort of film made about Carol, and the richness of the life, and how that could be then used to look at the work again as well.
Amazing. That would be absolutely incredible. Well, as much as I would like to talk about Carol's work all evening, all that's left really for me to say is thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us tonight from Carol's studio, no less. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Eloise.
To speak with you. And yeah, hopefully some insights on extraction and on Carol's practice for everyone. Janaki, our lovely curatorial assistant, has put a link in the chat, which has a feedback form if anyone would like to give us some feedback on this talk or any of the extraction public programs. That would be much appreciated. And otherwise, I hope everyone has a wonderful evening, and thank you so much for joining us.